Welcome everyone. We'll get started in a moment. All right. Welcome everyone. Welcome Towards an Australia, New Zealand Pacific Youth SDG Index, a youth-led pilot to measure progress towards the SDGs webinar launch event. It's super exciting to have you all here. It's going to be a wonderful evening, so I really appreciate your time. My name is Isabelle Zhu-Maguire, and I'm the Network Coordinator for the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Network for Youth. And today we're going to be attempting to answer and share some insight into some humongous questions, such as can we use the SDGs to measure youth progress towards sustainable development? And are youth really lagging behind the general population when it comes to these sustainable development challenges? So I'd like to start off with an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which we're all zooming in from today. I'd like to acknowledge the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, from whose lands I'm zooming in from today, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to say that I hope that this acknowledgement of country is not just an acknowledgement of country, but an acknowledgement of Indigenous knowledge and leadership within sustainable development. I hope you'll see that throughout this report that the young people we engaged with, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, repeatedly told us that they were looking for greater youth involvement when it comes to Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous leadership within sustainable development. So I hope that underscores our discussion and that this acknowledgement is just a start of the engagement that we have. Just a forewarning as well, we will be discussing some sensitive topics today, including mental health and suicide mortality rates. A little bit of a summary of what the night's going to look like. So we're going to start off with an introduction, which I'm doing right now, of what the event is going to look like, but also of SDSN Youth, what we do and why we do it. Then we're lucky enough to have Professor John Thwaites with us tonight, who's going to be doing a bit of an introduction to what SDSN Youth does within our region, the Sustainable Development Goals and why it's all important. Then myself and my friend Mardi, who helped with the data analysis, will be doing a presentation of the methodology and results used within this research. And then we're lucky enough to have some incredible panelists with us tonight who are going to engage with us in a Telenoa dialogue. These panelists will be sharing stories about youth engagement, about data collection, data analysis, and sustainable development to help us give an understanding of why the work we've done here is important and why it should continue into the future. And then I'll finally conclude the session with some ways you can keep engaging with the content of the report, as well as SDSN Youth, New Zealand Pacific. Just to let you know, closed captions should be available, but if there are any issues, please let us know in the chat box. And that brings us to, if you do have any issues throughout the session, please do use the chat function to let the hosts and panelists know. Also, just some simple rules of engagement: be respectful and open-minded. Also, one of the challenges that I personally often face is that I have unstable internet every once in a while. So please do let me know if my internet's failing me, and maybe I'll turn my camera off to make things a bit easier. Also, just to let you know that this session will be recorded. So if you miss any part of this session or you want to revisit it, you will be able to. It'll be uploaded to the website, which we will make available now. Also, if you would like to share it with colleagues or other people you think would be interested in the report findings, you can also find it on the website. And that gives us the perfect segue to the actual report itself. So I have the honor and privilege to be able to announce this report and share it with you all. So as I said, there's links in the chat you should be able to get through. The first link is the link that'll take you to the whole landing page, but there is a backup link because we did have some issues earlier today with the link itself. Or you can scan the QR code on the screen or follow that bit.ly link, which will be shared throughout this presentation. This link will take you to a website that looks like this. This website, you should be able to click on the cover of the report, this link here or this link here, and you'll be able to download the report, and please do share it widely. That would be incredible. So before we hear from John Thwaites, I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction about who SDSN Youth is and why we do the work that we do. So the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, or SDSN Youth, is one of the world's largest global youth-run networks connecting young people with the goal of localizing and promoting the Sustainable Development Goals. We do a lot of work with university students, high school students, and also young professionals throughout the world. And our overall goal is to connect young people with the resources and skills and ideas and people to help mobilize them to create sustainable development within their communities and globally. And I think one of the questions we answer here is why youth? You know, a lot of people are talking about youth engagement, but why is it important to do so? And so youth are incredibly enthusiastic about ensuring the future that we have to live for. The other things are that young people currently, we're the most empathetic generation to have ever existed. We're also the most well-educated generation to have ever existed. But also we're quite concerned and scared. And I think a lot of us are quite fearful about what our future holds. And this fear can either be very motivating, but it also can be very unmotivating. And so a part of what we do at SDSN Youth is connecting young people with these skills to make sure that they do feel empowered to localize and promote sustainable development so that they can act upon this concern and fear and continue to have hope. So I now have the pleasure to introduce Professor John Thwaites. He provided a lot of mentorship and advice and guidance throughout this report writing, and he's also a huge advocate for youth engagement within our region, having supported SDSN Youth for a while now. So I will read a little bit of a bio. So John Thwaites is the chair of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute and Climate Work Centre. John is also the chair of the National Sustainable Development Council, which developed the Transforming Australia SDG progress reports, and is the co-chair of the Leadership Council of UN SDSN globally. Thank you so much, John. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Izzy. And I'd like to start also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I am. I'm on Boonwurrung country at the moment, but I pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and acknowledge the custodianship for more than 60,000 years. Izzy, congratulations to you and the team on this SDG Youth Index report. As far as I'm aware, it's the first in the world, and I think it's a really great report. You talked about SDSN Youth. I should explain that I'm chair of SDSN for Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific. And SDSN stands for Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And it's a network of universities and knowledge institutions around the world that are committed to the Sustainable Development Goals and to promoting sustainable development. There are more than 2,000 members. And of course, SDSN Youth is a key part of what we do. Now, as you pointed out, Izzy, I think a lot of young people are rightly concerned about their future. And so many of the issues that are in the Sustainable Development Goals are issues that are of serious concern for young people, like will they have a good and fair paying job? Will they be able to get access to housing at an affordable cost? And importantly, what is the impact of climate change and environmental degradation going to be on their lives and the lives of their children when they have them? So these are really important points, but also young people are powerful agents of change. We've seen through history how it's very often been young people that come up with the ideas and the new approaches that make it possible to do things that we didn't think were possible before. And so harnessing that innovation and that spirit of anything can happen that young people have, I think is crucial for the success of the Sustainable Development Goals. The challenge, though, is that the Sustainable Development Goals, frankly, don't incorporate enough consideration of young people. And when they were developed, most of you who are here on this call today probably weren't part of that process. And I think this report calls that out and calls out the need for young people to be much more involved in the whole process of setting the goals, setting the targets, and setting the plans to achieve them. We're now at the halfway point of the Sustainable Development Goals. The goals aim to be achieved by 2030. They were agreed by countries in 2015. If we're going to achieve the goals, we're going to have to really get ourselves moving. And I think this report is highlighting a really important point about achieving the goals, and that is that we're going to take much more notice of young people and young people's views. So I'm looking forward today to hearing more about the report and to having a really good discussion with everyone about how young people can have a much greater say in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thanks, Izzy.
Thank you so much, John. I hope everyone's giving a virtual round of applause wherever they are. Thank you so much for highlighting that. Yeah, and I do hope that this report does exactly what you've said. So now we are going to be moving into a presentation of the methodology and the results of the report. So as mentioned, our starting point were the Sustainable Development Goals. These goals were released in 2015, and they had this explicit purpose of making sure that they were measurable. So they have this enormous list of attached targets and indicators, which can be used to make sure that the world is moving towards these very specific actions, but also making sure that we have a mechanism to track whether or not we are achieving these actions. So the question that we wanted to ask, as John sort of alluded to, was, do these SDGs currently represent the concerns of young people, particularly in Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific where we're located? As John said, young people were not really a part of the process of creating these goals, because if you think of an 18-year-old now, they were only 10 years old when these goals were created, and they'll be 25 when these goals end in 2030. And so they had no chance to be a part of the process to create these goals, yet they are the goals that are meant to be ensuring their futures. But the other question that we are asking is, can these SDGs measure the concerns that young people have in Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific? So that's where the aim of this report sort of came in, is that we're undertaking this youth-led report to capture progress on this SDGs that matter to young people. So we had particular inspiration from a couple of reports that I just wanted to talk about. Firstly, we were very much inspired by the Sustainable Development Report, which is released by SDSN every year. The 2023 one just got released if you're interested in having a look. But basically, we were inspired by the fact that they use the SDGs to measure progress towards this sustainable development, and the fact that this is such a global and international effort to collect these statistics and create this database. The other thing that we really liked about this is that it's a yearly endeavour to track progress, and that's something ideally we want to be doing with this report that we're releasing. The other report that we were particularly inspired by was the Transforming Australia SDG Progress Reports. So these reports similarly use the SDGs to measure progress, but what we were inspired by was that the team behind Transforming Australia created specific indicators that measure progress for Australia that are about the issues that Australians are facing. And so we took these to create the report and as inspiration. But one of the things we wanted to we noticed throughout these reports is that young people are not really recognized that thoroughly throughout this report. There is one indicator in both reports, which is to do with education and employment, in which young people are considered. But in general, there's minimal disaggregation within these processes that's considered. Obviously, that's understandable as these are huge processes to come together, but we wanted to create some sort of recognition of the fact that different people will experience sustainable development in different ways. And the other thing is that the fact that these reports only reflected young people in one section of society is very much contradictory to the ways that young people are talking about the sustainable development challenges, right? Young people are at the forefront of all these advocacy campaigns amongst all of these issues because they are saying that they are being disproportionately impacted by these challenges. So that's sort of the background to why this report came about and what we're doing here. And so as a bit of a summary, we are using the SDGs to measure youth progress towards sustainable development compared to the general population. We did this to create this methodology that we hope that other people can work with, build upon and create so that they can make their own research into how different populations experience sustainable development in different ways. But also we wanted to ask this question, do the SDGs in their current form work for youth? Do they represent us? Can we measure our progress using them? So a little bit of a summary of the methodology before Mardi will jump into the nitty-gritty of the data analysis. So we started off this process with the 169 SDG targets that are within the Sustainable Development Goal framework. And what we did is that we shortlisted this to 52 targets that we felt that were most important to Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific. From there, what we did is that we engaged with over 40 different young people from across the region. These young people were mostly university students and recent graduates, and we did 7 consultation sessions to try and prioritize these targets into the ones that young people were most particularly concerned about. And so from that, we created 20 different targets that were specific to youth and the ways that young people experience sustainable development. Then we completed a data analysis. So we used a compound annual growth rate calculation to measure progress towards these youth-specific indicators for the region. We assigned a traffic light system to organize these calculations, and that's what's presented in the report. Finally, if you've already had a bit of a flick through the report, you'll find that a lot of the time we were unable to find data that was disaggregated into ages. And so there was a lot of empty spaces where we didn't have the data to back up the concerns that young people had. So what we did is that we engaged young people in a testimonial process where we got young people to do further research and write testimonials about their personal experiences with sustainable development to make sure that those issues and concerns were still represented within our report. So this is our little data team that worked together to put the data together. So myself, Mardi and Alice were Monash University students who helped us with the process of collecting the data, sorting it out and analyzing it, which was very fantastic. And luckily we have the wonderful Mardi with us here today, who will be helping talk through the data itself. So Mardi will talk quickly about the data sourcing, how we found it, the calculations that we used, the traffic light system that they came up with, and how you can read the graphs that are presented in the report. Mardi, you can just let me know when you need me to switch to the next slide.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction, Izzy. And I'm sure we can all agree that your passion is very inspiring. So we're very lucky that Alice and I got to work with you as interns, and really awesome to see this whole thing come together. But yeah, so our first step in the data analysis process was, of course, sourcing the data. And we have a bit of a decision tree, which we'll show you on the next slide, as to how we went through the collection process. But yeah, so it basically involved desktop research, and our immediate source was to go with something from a National Statistics Office, which is predominantly things like the ABS and other government source data. Of course, as Izzy mentioned, sometimes this is not particularly available. So our next step would be to look at any NGO publications. Also, some universities had well-referenced studies which we could use data from. This process was very similar to the Transforming Australia report, which was also mentioned before. So we're looking at data from Australia, New Zealand and Pacific countries. one thing we found particularly was that data was quite scarce. Looking in the Pacific region, it was quite difficult to find, in particular, like hubs that we had available in Australia and New Zealand. So that was quite a challenge and really shed some light on the situation about how we need to address these issues more with better data sources in particular. So if we go to the next slide, so this is our decision tree here, which Alice and I developed. And basically it was just to make sure that if it was available, we were using the most credible data source. So that was our first step there. And then looking at consistency as well, because we didn't want to end up comparing our numbers which weren't actually consistent across different regions, because that might give a message that wasn't quite accurate. And then our next step is looking at disaggregated data. So as Izzy mentioned before, we did need to find, and we had a couple of different definitions of youth. So when we narrowed down what we would be considering our youth group, we then needed that to be considered against the wider population. So that at times was difficult as well. And then got some other sort of contingency plans. If we couldn't find suitable data, then maybe we would redirect our framework for that indicator and maybe go with something where there was more data available. And then we, of course, had to compare timeframes between different regions and different populations. So we had to make the decision as well that if our time data was, so if the time series was not comparable, then we might need to reevaluate. Oh, and next slide, please. Thank you. As Izzy mentioned, we were using the compound annual growth rate to do our analysis, and you'll see in the next slide as well how that actually shows up visually. And as John mentioned, we were comparing points in 2015 and looking at their trajectory if we were to meet the 2030 target. And this was a bit of an interesting challenge as well. We did play around with a few different ways of representing the desired path to reach the goal and how much work a population needs to put in, and then how to compare that between the two disaggregated populations. But we have this little formula here, which might look a bit confusing, but it is fairly simple. So in the bracket there, V final is like the final goal. So that's the 2030 SDG goal that was decided upon and that everyone is kind of aiming for. And then V begin is the most recent data that we have where that population is sitting at the time. So, and then T is the number of years between the 2030 endpoint and then the time at which the most recent data point was available. So for example, if we had a population of youth in Australia, maybe we had data from 2014, we'd have the V begin number would be that value, V final would be the goal, and then T would be 16 because it's 16 years until 2030. I'm also happy to take any questions. If you've got some more specific questions, I'll be looking at the chat box later. Yeah, so as it says down below, it's a relatively simple calculation, and we use this method just because of the limited availability of data. So this was very helpful for being able to draw a consistent comparison between different data sets. And of course, it did allow us to track the progress of different populations to meet their goals. So if we jump to the next slide, this is a great example of one of the graphs that we made here. So as you can see with the filled in red and blue lines, so blue is the overall general population, and then red is where we were able to find a disaggregated youth population from a particular region. We've got their point, so the most recent data point at 2020 that we were able to compare. And then using that formula that we saw before, the dotted line shows the trajectory that is necessary to meet the 2030 target, which is there in the green dotted line. And this particular one was New Zealand youth, so that's the red line, compared to the general population and their levels of psychological distress. So it was a lot of fun making these graphs. I think we did enjoy that. Sorry. And then, also inspired by the Transforming Australia report, we decided to go for a traffic light system, in particular because it's quite easy to demonstrate differences in a visual way and highlight for people where youth may or may not be falling behind the rest of the population, or even be in front. And we hoped that would kind of bring to light these issues that we're talking about. So we did have some discussion for choosing these numbers, and we ended up going with sorry, I'll double back. The CAGR rate is basically change required to meet the goal. So the larger the number means more change required to meet the goal. So that's why we've got for that top traffic light there, 10 to 15. And that's kind of just general units of whatever value is being analysed, and the change required to meet whichever unit of value was decided on for the 2030 SDG result. Again, feel free to throw me any questions if that's confusing. So yeah, we decided on 10 to 15 was the most change required to meet that goal. And then 6 to 10 is significant changes, but not as bad. 3 to 6 for the yellow traffic light, a smaller amount of change. And then green, which also included populations that had already met that target, or they only needed quite a small amount of change. So it's a good way to kind of put into umbrella terms how much progress was required for each of these populations. And then of course this grey dot, which became very important, was to show that we actually didn't have the data for a particular population. So you'll probably see, if you do look into that report, a few grey dots in there, which became good talking points for the fact that we do need more research to happen before we can have these conversations. Yeah, so feel free to put any questions in the chat and I'll be very happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Mardi. It's so nice to be interacting with you again. It was so crazy to work together for so long, and it's so nice to have this little reunion. So thank you so much, Mardi. And as mentioned, you can use the Q&A function. Mardi will probably be answering away, but if anything gets unanswered or you think of anything afterwards, you can find my email address in the report, and I'm happy to pass things on to Mardi and Alice to give you a better understanding of the data. So thank you so much. Amazing. So now I want to talk through a little bit of the results that we found. And so as sort of has been alluded to, there's sort of 3 subsets of results that were found. The first was that we have data that we did find and that we were able to measure. We then also have data that we have results of the data that we could not find. And then we have all these indicators that young people told us that they cared about a lot, but that we were unable to find ways to properly disaggregate or measure in terms of youth progress compared to the general population. So a little bit of a reminder, this is what the traffic light system looks like. Also, just to let you know, because of the differences in all the time series, it's not accurate to compare between countries. So it's not really accurate to compare Australia and New Zealand with each other, for instance. It's most accurate to compare within the country. So comparing the youth versus the general population. So that's the way to sort of read the report. So in terms of the places where we did find data, so we were able to find data for this target here, which is 1.5 youth, which is to, by 2030, reduce youth poverty rates to less than 5% of youth living below the poverty line. So we're only able to find data for Australia. And as you will be able to see in the graph in the report, young people were slightly disproportionately impacted by this challenge. This target was chosen because the youth that we consulted with told us that they believe that young people are disproportionately impacted by poverty, economic, social, and environmental shocks. A lot of them told us that during the pandemic, they found it increasingly hard to save money, which made them really fearful that whatever the next inevitable economic, social, and environmental shock would be, that they would be unable to adapt to the challenges that they face. So this is what the graph looks like. I won't be going through all the graphs during this session, unfortunately, but you can check them all out in the report. The second one we were able to find data for was a 3.4 Youth 1, which is by 2030, youth psychological distress should equalise the general population's 2030 target, which is to reduce psychological distress by 1/3. We were able to find data for Australia and New Zealand, and both these populations, the young people were disproportionately impacted. Importantly, that for data for Australia, we were only able to find data up until 2017. So we don't actually have a measure of what COVID-19 did to mental health among these populations. Yeah, young people told us that because of their disproportionate access to social media ever since they were young, the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis, as well as the climate crisis that looms amongst all of us, were reasons why young people have worse psychological distress than the general population. It was actually really common that throughout these consultation processes that this target 3.4 was chosen purely because of its mention of mental health and well-being, and young people told us that they were particularly disappointed that there wasn't a separate one for mental health on its own. Similarly, we did also find data for suicide mortality. Once again, young people were disproportionately more likely to die by suicide. Another thing that we were told during this process was that young people were from culturally diverse backgrounds, but also from the Pacific, told us that the elders within their communities were less likely to understand their mental health challenges, and therefore they felt this experience more acutely. The next one is Indigenous youth life expectancy to be less than 1 year different to the rest of the youth population's life expectancy. Now, this was the only indicator where young people and the current generation was doing slightly better than the general population. However, as you can see by the data, there are still very significant challenges when it comes to Indigenous issues. So we included this issue, as was said during the acknowledgement, that young people wanted more acknowledgement of Indigenous challenges, but also Indigenous knowledge throughout the Sustainable Development Framework. Young people told us that they were particularly concerned about the Indigenous populations within their communities and that they were experiencing these challenges more acutely. We found data for by 2030, youth unemployment to be less than 5% of the population by 2030. As mentioned, unemployment is one of those indicators that is often measured when it comes to youth. And in every place we found that young people were disproportionately impacted by this challenge. During the consultations, it was told to us that young people, all of the students we were interacting with were in fact young people who were university students or graduates. And a lot of them were telling us that even though they were pursuing higher education, they were really concerned that they would be unable to find work that is stable and fulfilling. We were told that this issue is felt more severely amongst young people within the Pacific, as young people told us that unemployment was a very severe issue for their communities and had caused young people to turn to things like illicit substances because they were unable to find work. 11.1.youth1 is by 2030, youth renters paying more than 30% of income on housing costs should be reduced by 2/3. Again, we were only able to find data for Australia. And this one we could find that young people were significantly disproportionately impacted by this. Young people from New Zealand and Australia particularly told us that they had experienced housing insecurity for the first time ever during the pandemic, and others told us that it was very difficult for them to secure leases. One person did tell us that they had to move back with their parents because they were unable to afford the share house that they were living in. And 11.1.youth2 is by 2030, youth homelessness to be less than 0.5% of the youth population. Once again, we found young people disproportionately impacted by this challenge, quite significantly so. And when talking to young people during the consultations, in general, young people were telling us that in their communities, they were seeing more homeless people than ever. And the other thing was that young people acknowledged that this is a very intersectional issue and that they were very concerned, particularly for the ways in which homelessness impacts LGBT and Indigenous communities more intensely. So that's all the data we could find, but that leaves us all the data that we couldn't find. So as Mardi said, the grey dot became very annoying, but also very important to what we found in this study. And that is that a lot of these issues are not being measured in a disaggregated way. And so the issues that young people care about and we were unable to find data for were food insecurity, sexual and reproductive healthcare services, access to affordable and clean renewable energy, ensuring youth that had access to social protection programs, genuine and effective inclusion of young people within NDCs, and also ensuring that there is genuine and effective youth representation in all forms of governance. Finally, there were other general youth concerns that we found throughout the consultation process that we were unable to find ways to create a disaggregated indicator for, but we still wanted to represent them somehow because they were important to young people. So these issues included sustainable tourism, upgrading infrastructure and retrofitting industries, cultural and natural heritage, global food waste, getting companies to adopt sustainable practices, improving education, and also taking urgent and significant action on biodiversity. I also just wanted to make a quick mention of who these young people were in the consultations, right? Like I've been saying, young people this, young people that. And I wanted to make mention that we were able to get quite a large cohort of young people to be a part of these processes, which was extremely exciting and very valuable. And I thank every single young person. I've seen some of them within the list of people attending this session today. So if you came along to one of these sessions, I'm very grateful. And I hope that you're extremely excited that this report has finally come to fruition. Finally, before we jump into the Talanoa discussion, I wanted to quickly talk about the key messages that we're putting out there that are to do with this report and to start getting you to think about how you can action this within your work and in your advocacy. So the first thing we want to say is that this is an important exercise. We found, as was mentioned, only in one indicator were youth actually doing about the same as the rest of the population, if not a bit better. In every other indicator we were able to find data, young people were lagging behind, which is really very concerning. And so I think we're sort of advocating that it's probably indicative of a larger trend in which young people are feeling disproportionately impacted by these challenges. And so we have to be doing these sorts of measurement processes to measure the ways that different populations are experiencing sustainable development so that we're not leaving anyone behind on the road towards the sustainable development goals. We are also advocating that there needs to be greater age disaggregation within data collection, or greater disaggregation in general. As was said, we couldn't find a lot of data that was disaggregated into ages. And so we're sort of advocating the fact that there is this blind spot within researchers and advocates and policymakers in particular, because they don't have access to data which shows the ways in which young people are being disproportionately impacted by these challenges. And so that's why we're advocating that people who are collecting data should be doing more to try think about if it's possible to collect data disaggregated into ages. And finally, the other thing we are advocating for is that we need more genuine inclusion of youth within these decision-making processes. And so, as was mentioned, the young people of today were not a part of the processes to create these goals. Obviously, that couldn't be helped then, but if there's any future iterations of the goals, then hopefully we can have more genuine and fulfilled engagement with young people. And I show these two pie charts here because I think they're very important. So during the consultation sessions, I basically got the young people to go through this huge list of the Sustainable Development Goals targets and mark which ones they cared about the most. And for most of the young people, this was the first time that they had done this deep dive into the Sustainable Development Goals. So what I did is at the beginning of the session, I asked young people, do you think these goals represent your concerns? And then I asked them the same question at the end of the session. And as you can see, at the beginning of the session, most young people were saying yes, that the Sustainable Development Goals were in fact representative of their concerns. However, after we had done this deep dive into what the goals actually were, young people then turned around and told us, for the most part, that these goals were no longer inclusive of their concerns. the young people told us that the language was not inclusive enough, that they told us that goals were not strict or ambitious enough. They told us that economic growth and this focus on economic growth was concerning to them. And they were also telling us that they were concerned about who the targets were designed for. And so I think that's why we're advocating on this concern that young people do need to be a part of these processes to make sure that our ideas are represented within these processes. So in terms of next steps, because we want to make sure that this report has legs and that it gets engaged with in multiple different ways. So I want to share my 2 goals on how we want to engage this report within the international discourse of sustainable development goals. So my first goal is that I want to make sure that there's this international effort to start measuring the disproportionate impacts of sustainable development challenges. So these are the impacts that young people are feeling, but also other populations who are impacted differently. And the way that we're doing this is we want to make this methodology available. We want to work with you if you're interested in working to create your own research. To make sure that we can create some sort of long-term and also large international effort to measure the ways that sustainable development is experienced differently. The other goal that we have for this report is that, as I said, we want to advocate for greater youth engagement and that this report's findings can be embedded within the work that people do within sustainable development. And so in terms of how we're doing that is that we want to work with organizations about how they can improve their youth engagement and use what we've learned within what they're doing. So the way that we're offering to do this is that we're likely going to be doing some workshops or some other informational sessions on how you can engage with us further. So there's a link that's in the chat or also on the screen right now, and that will take you to an expression of interest form, which you can fill out, and hopefully I can get back to you on ways that we can work with you to improve and spread the methodology, as well as how we can create greater genuine youth engagement. Okay, so that's the report. I now wanted to turn to the Talanoa discussion that we have planned. So the Talanoa discussion, I have some incredible panelists who are here with me today to share the different ways that they have experienced sustainable development, that they've experienced youth, or they have experienced data collection. And I'm using this Talanoa discussion as a tool for doing this, as I think it's very cool and very important. And so it's a tool that's been used by the UNFCCC at their COPs, because they too think it's an important tool. So I just wanted to read a little bit from the UNFCCC website to try and explain to you what we're doing here today. So the Talanoa is a traditional word used in Fiji and across the Pacific to reflect a process of inclusive, participatory, and transparent dialogue. The purpose of Talanoa is to share stories, build empathy, and to make wise decisions for the collective good. The process of Talanoa involves the sharing of ideas, skills, and experience through storytelling. And so that's what we're doing today. So Talanoas sometimes look like this, where people get together and they're sharing these personal stories and they listen to one another to create their own ideas. They come to the table without judgment to make their own decisions. But also Talanoas have also looked like this. They have looked like this because they are an important tool and have been used to create greater empathy around things like climate change. So how are we doing it today? Each of the panelists that we have are going to have 5 minutes to tell a story that they've prepared. Some people have some photos that we're going to be sharing as well. And they're going to be telling us these stories of sustainable development, of youth engagement, and the SDGs. And I want you to come with this with open-mindedness and also just not passing judgment, to come up with your own decisions about what we did with this report. Is what we did with this report useful for our region? Is this something that we want to keep doing? I obviously have my biased opinions, but the Talanoa is to make you come up with your own. So these are the panelists that we have today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce them one by one, and then they are going to present their story after I've introduced them. But just a little overview of the incredible people we have here today. We've got John Thwaites, who's going to tell us another story. We've got Imogen Kane, who is the Australian Youth Representative to the United Nations for 2023. Unfortunately, Harleen is unwell today, so she won't be presenting. We've got Cameron, who works for UNICEF, East Asia and the Pacific. We've got the wonderful Ellen Dixon, who is the project lead of the SDG student program for SDSN youth. And then we have a video from Alex Dayant, who is a senior economist and deputy director of the Indo-Pacific Development Center at the Lowy Institute. So I've got John Thwaites is going up first. So I've already introduced you, John. So I hope you don't mind if I skip out on your bio again. But this is the photo you have to share. This one here. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Izzy. And before I talk about that part of the Talanoa, I just mentioned that I did chair the Transforming Australia report, which did a report on the Sustainable Development Goals in Australia using the same principles that Mardi and her team did for the youth report. And I think it's really interesting to be able to compare those two reports. But what I wanted to highlight was a story that relates to young people and the SDGs. And I want to take you back to 2014 in New York City, which was just before the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed, a year before they were agreed in New York at the United Nations. And two Monash students that you'll see there on the photo, Sam Loney and Gemma Muir, attended New York and spoke about their vision for the Sustainable Development Goals at the International Conference on Sustainable Development Practice. But they also spoke at the Leadership Council of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network in New York. And that council has a lot of pretty high-powered figures on it, including at the time the former president of Finland, the former Prime Minister of Greece, a number of foreign ministers, very well-known academics like Jeff Sachs and Johan Rockström. And what Sam and Gemma did was present their idea for the establishment of SDSN Youth. And this was to be a new part of SDSN that would be led by students and young people around the world. And Sam and Gemma explained that they had set an organisation up in Australia called SDSN Youth Solutions, which had had a very successful youth conference and had also proposed a number of really important activities for young people to lead, including developing presentations on the Sustainable Development Goals for high school students, mobilising support from students for climate action, and developing social media channels to keep young people informed about the Sustainable Development Goals. So Sam and Gemma presented to the Leadership Council, and they did a great job, but Sam did highlight the concern that young people had, which was that really young people had not been sufficiently considered by the United Nations or by other organisations in establishing the Sustainable Development Goals. And that actually led to a bit of kickback from the Leadership Council, and some people on the Leadership Council even said, well, what are young people able to achieve? Did young people really have any answers? So the generation gap was alive and well at the Leadership Council. But then Sam and Gemma kicked back themselves in what was described later as a counterpunch, and highlighted some of the fantastic activities they'd been leading in Australia with other young people, and that if young people weren't given a chance to lead activities, how could the UN really understand the priorities and important areas for young people? And they won the day, and the Leadership Council then agreed to set up SDSN Youth, which has since become a global organisation in most countries of the world that's doing fantastic work engaging young people in delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals. So it just shows you a couple of young people who are prepared to really courageously address a group of important older people and convince them of the merits of their case. And that's my story.
That's an incredible story. I love it so much, and I think it's the best introduction to SDSN youth and how it all came about. So thank you so much, John, for sharing that story and the photo attached. I am now going to introduce Imogen Kane, who's the next panelist on this talanoa. So Imogen Kane is a gender and youth advocate, working in spaces to promote quality holistic education and gender inequality, and to address gender inequality and youth issues. Imogen has worked for the Cotton On Foundation and as their impact coordinator, working for education, mental health and environment projects across Australia, Uganda, South Africa and Thailand. She is very excitingly the Australian Youth Representative to the United Nations for 2023. So she's jet setting all around the country, and so we're very grateful she could find time to do this today. And I also just wanted to mention that she's a dear friend of mine, and I'm very happy to see her doing all these amazing things. So over to you, Imogen, for your story.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you. So hello, my name is Imogen. I am coming from Albany, WA today as part of my regional road trip in Western Australia, but I wanted to acknowledge the fact that it is Menang land, so it is Menang people are the traditional owners of the land that I'm dialing in from today. So as part of my role, I am speaking to hundreds and thousands of young people in Australia, and it's so hard to pick, one story to share. So instead, I've got little snippets and quotes throughout my journey so far that I think are impactful. So firstly, just something I've discovered along this journey as the Youth Rep for Australia is the complete diversity of knowledge of the SDGs themselves across Australian youth. Typically in well-built up areas and cities, there's really good knowledge and understanding of the general concept of the SDGs. But when I head into rural and regional towns, the knowledge is scattered and really hit and miss. And I think what's most fascinating is that whenever I speak to teachers or industry professionals, or what I would consider people who don't fall into the youth category who are adults, they have never heard of the SDGs before. So it is an interesting journey that we're going on today. When I'm talking to young people about which SDGs they relate to, typically they have difficulty in relating the SDGs back to their personal life, or Australia as a region. Instead, they can only see it in a global international sense. So the fact that this report is delving into how the SDGs actually connects to young people in their day-to-day and the challenges they're experiencing, I think is quite unique and might help bridge that gap. Also, just in regards to my role as youth rep, I'm finding most of my job is in fact educating young people on the SDGs so that they have that global language to be able to talk about issues with others from around the world to create impact. So more into the stories, which is what you want to hear. So in regards to SDG 3, good health and wellbeing, which was discussed earlier, mental health continues to come forward in my consultations. And in particular, someone defined it to me as an epidemic of loneliness, and the fact that the quality of friendships after COVID was lacking. Young people lacked spaces in which to develop these connections, and even the lack of skills to be able to make friendships. I keep hearing the term of it gets harder as you get older to make friends. So even in university levels, people are struggling to make new connections, despite the fact they have a lot of shared interests with their cohort. Relationships are typically surface level, and as a young person explained to me that they had no one to call when they were needing help. They felt like they did not have a deep enough friendship with anyone that they could call someone when they really needed to talk to someone. So people are never alone, but they're lonely, which is heartbreaking, but also not surprising, and actually rings true for many people when I tell them that, and even for myself. SDG 4, quality education, there's a lack of connection between young people and their educators. And they're often feeling like the priorities of the education system are misplaced and young people are therefore disengaged. One person explained to me that they felt like their school cared more about what socks they were wearing than their current state of mind and their current health or their educational outcomes. They felt that schooling was based on reputation, and they actually didn't care about the students. So as they explained to me, that they just wanted someone to believe in them and believe in their potential. And the fact that they were not getting that says a lot about the current state of the education system. And that was from a regional student. In regards to decent work and economic growth, that continues to be something that shines through, which when I tell adults that, they always seem surprised, but of course young people are concerned and have genuine anxiety and are paying attention to the economy. It is directly going to impact them now and into the future. So young people are stressing to me that they feel like policy is never future-proofed. So they're trying to fix the issues for the here and now, typically in a political sense, in a way of winning votes, and they're not making good economic policy for young people and for the future. So that, combined with the fact that young people are struggling with the cost of living right now, means that young people don't have the financial literacy to assist them in the crisis they're facing. There's a lack of policy helping drive economic policy to help them in future, and therefore they themselves are not ready for the future, and they haven't future-proofed their own finances. So it's a bit of a perfect storm, and they see it coming. Lastly, just I'll be quick, but the last one that continues to shine as well through consultations is peace, justice, and strong institutions. A young person, quite a lot of young people, especially in rural and regional towns, so in Queensland in particular, we're talking about how they've personally had experiences with youth justice or with youth crime. And someone had been the victim of a carjacking. Someone else had just on the way to school had seen crime take place, like a break-in happen. And basically it led to an overall sensation of a lack of safety. So they didn't feel safe in their own communities. And that, combined with the fact that young people see communication and strategic sort of planning between police, policymakers and the courts, meaning that root causes of these issues are never solved, but also assumptions are made about offenders. So on one hand, young people don't feel safe to walk to school. On the other hand, they feel that if they're having to engage with services like police, that assumptions are being made about them, and potentially they're being looked at in a certain way. One person in Victoria was explaining to me about how, because he was African Australian, especially with the rhetoric a few years ago of African gangs, he felt like every time he had to come across services such as police, he was anxious about the way he would be treated. So there's a lot to unpack there, and a lot of sort of different factors coming into that. I guess this was just to finish, generational gap and generational divide is something I'm continuously noticing in every conversation I have. Young people are wanting to be respected and heard, and when I'm speaking to other people, they're saying that young people aren't respecting older people enough. So there's a lack of understanding there, and it seems that the ability for a respectful conversation is getting increasingly difficult. Young people are being told two specific things. One, good luck, solve the world's problems, it's up to you now. And then at the same time, they're being told you're too young to comment on things like this. You're too naive, you have no world experience, what could you possibly provide? And John's story completely backs up that, and it continues to be felt by young people today. So I'll wrap it up there. I'm more than happy to answer questions, but young people have a lot to offer, and so therefore hopefully we can come to the table and be able to be a part of policy and decision making to make it more future proofed for the next generation.
Imogen, that was so wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing such a holistic understanding of what the SDGs mean to Australian youth at large. That was incredible. Thank you so much. I now have the pleasure of introducing Cameron. So Cameron is a passionate youth advocate who champions sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender equality, and meaningful youth engagement. He was part of the regional UN ECOSOC and regional Asia-Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development Youth Call to Action document, and is embarking on a self-sponsored trip to the East Sepik province of Papua New Guinea for capacity building purposes in both a rural and urban context. I've also been had had the pleasure to work with Cameron very recently, and so I think it's a wonderful opportunity to get you to speak to us all today. You also have provided photos, so I will be sharing those now.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Izzy. And hi, everyone. My name is Cameron, and I am a youth advocate. I champion sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender equality, and meaningful youth engagement. So a little bit about me, the advocacy levels which I sort of work on is mainly on a community-based level. So I'm currently engaged with the UNICEF East Asia and Pacific under the Young People's Action Team, which is a program led by the IAPRO office, and we work sort of hand in hand with the UNICEF country offices in our respective countries. So with regard to the community-based levels, that includes the sort of the rural levels in the country, in communities within the country, and also I also engage on a national level, such as facilitating events for like countrywide events. And I do advocacy on the regional level. So in one of the photos that's being shared, which would be on my left-hand side, is that was during the 2022 Asia Pacific Youth Forum in Bangkok, Thailand last year, where I represented my country, Papua New Guinea. And the photo on my right-hand side is that was a community engagement which I did with rural youths or urban youths living in urban areas, but these are disadvantaged youths. So basically, with regard to problems which, like within my level of work, with regards to the problems that I see, a lot of these problems, they mainly lead to lack of awareness, lack of opportunity, and again, like what Imogen had mentioned, safety. So with lack of opportunities in like a country like mine, where you've got all sorts of factors such as transportation and many other factors that cannot really connect the country properly. There's a lack of awareness. So many of the youth, especially youth in the rural area, they're left in the dark, basically. So a lot of the young people, a lot of the youth that I spoke with, they do not know, they do not even have a clear idea of what the SDGs are, let alone the United Nations itself. So that is one. And again, because of lack of infrastructural development and such, there's a lot of opportunities that these youths are not aware of. So there's a very big gap between a youth living in a urban area and the youth living in the rural area, because they've got there's the opportunities that we get or we receive, many of these opportunities which we take for granted in the cities, in the towns. The youth in the rural areas do not know about those opportunities. So, and with regard to safety, for a country like mine, safety is a very big issue, especially for women and girls. It's very unsafe for them. Unfortunately, it's unsafe for them because of many socioeconomic factors in the country, which we see. So safety, and also for young men and boys, safety is it's sort of a big impact. Like because of safety, they cannot really do things. They cannot really flourish like how we want them to flourish, basically. So just moving on to like a little bit of solutions that I, as a youth advocate, see, like practical solutions which can be done would be more youth-led advocacy or community-led advocacy, which is also youth-led, because like with young people, one thing that I've learned is when you're engaging with a young person, they would understand you better if they see that you're a young person like them. And this community-led advocacy, it would be good for it to be for it to take place outside an urban context, because like for a country like mine, 80% of the population they live in rural areas, and a lot of the bulk of the population, or the population bulge for my country basically is youth, young people, 18 to 24, or how my country defines it, 18 to 30 years old. So with more community-led advocacy projects going to rural areas, I for one see that a lot of change can happen when people are aware about, for example, like when they are aware of the different opportunities out there, when they are aware of the different factors or different problems that we face in today's society, basically. And another key solution that I find is very useful, not only for my country, but I guess for a lot of the countries in the Pacific, would be the youth inclusion. And when creating opportunities, we need more youth inclusion. And youth inclusion not only means for service providers, not only for organizations to reach out to youth or to make youth as the audience, but it also includes young people being a part of creating these opportunities. Because I feel, for me personally, I feel that when a lot of stuff is more youth-led, when we have more youth-led initiatives, we as youth design the solutions that we want, basically. So we know what to put in when we are creating our opportunities for ourselves, when we're creating solutions. So yeah, that's a bit about the work that I do at community level. I also do regional level work within the Asia Pacific, and that's mainly with the organizations that I'm affiliated with. And a lot of the work I do is mainly representing my country in different conferences, different summits, different seminars, etc. And also when it comes to collecting information, I represent my country. So basically what I do is the advocacy at the community and at the rural level. I use that information to be a voice for a lot of the voiceless people in my country, basically, to represent them at this, at the regional stage, at the national stage. And representing them not only is, for me, it does not only include using their voice, but it also includes creating opportunities for them. Because a lot of the young people that I know, I tell them, I'm not the only one doing this, and I'm not going to be the only one doing this, where I have to represent you. Like, eventually, I want you, whether you're in a rural area, whether you're from a background that is not as good as mine, I want you to stand up, not only for your country, but for your people and for yourself as well. So I sort of look at myself like a pushing factor to many of the young people to get them. I tell young people, you can do better than me, but I want you to do 100 times much more better than what I'm doing for you. So yeah, that's a bit about me, and I'll hand it back over to Izzy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was an incredible perspective, and I'm very grateful that you were able to share that with us all today. So thank you so much, Cameron. And now I want to introduce Ellen Dixon. So Ellen Dixon represents New Zealand, Australia, and Canada at the Global Student Forum. She is also the Global SDG Student Program Project Lead within SDSN Youth and is the NZ USA National President. She's also a very impressive person that I have the pleasure to get to work with. So thank you so much for being here today. And I'm excited to hear your story.
Thank you so much, Izzy. Tēnā koutou, ko Ellen Dixon tōku ingoa. That's Te Reo Māori, just introducing myself and saying hello. I first want to say a big thank you to Izzy, Mardi, and the wider team for the wonderful work that you've done on this report, and for the privilege of being able to be here to speak and talk in this talanoa and share stories and ideas. I think it's always a privilege when we can all come together across the world and this region as a community in these spaces and share the things that are valuable to us in our heritage and in our cultures. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here. I will first give a little bit of an overview of the SDG Students Program, because I'm part of the family of SDSN Youth alongside Izzy, which is a privilege and a pleasure to work with you, Izzy, in that space. The SDG Students Program is part of the global team that works within the wider SDSN Youth Network. We represent over 69 universities from different countries across the world, spanning from the likes of Columbia University all the way to Monash. So thank you, Monash, for the wonderful work that you're doing in this space, and thank you for the championing that John previously talked about, which is where we got the wonderful work from Sam, which has evolved into what we are seeing here today. So yeah, it's really exciting to see that we can engage universities across the world in talking about the importance of things like an SDG Youth Index. My talanoa that I'm bringing here today is an interesting one. It is a combination of two images and a word that joins between the two. Unfortunately, I don't have the two images in front of me, so I'm going to elaborate in more of the oral tradition, what they look like. The first image was one that really struck me a couple of years ago that I saw floating around on social media, and it was a cartoon. It was an interesting looking cartoon because it was this barren world. It was just a singular frame cartoon, this barren world with these money bags around it, and a little child that was looking towards a businessman who had a mask on, who was using it to inhale oxygen because everything else around him was carbon dioxide. And he was passing a money bag to the tiny little child and saying, here's your inheritance for the future. This image made me mad. And I think it's one of the reasons why young people often come into these spaces, because they feel frustrated. I think it was Antonio Guterres who said, the frustration generated in young people that have no hope in the future is a major source of insecurity in today's world. And I can see a little bit of that coming through in the report that was put forward, because so often we're seeing what is inherited is not a custodianship, which is more in alignment with the traditional Pacific values that you will see whether you're in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or the wider Pacific, but is more often this element tied into a sort of neoliberal structure. We've seen the central element of youth citizenship be tied to the economy and citizenship in general to the economy, and we end up with this environment which is deteriorating. But as long as there is a businessman in a suit who can grab a mask and pass the money over to the next generation, are we succeeding? I think the answer to that is no. And that image has stuck with me for a long period of time, that the commodification of our universe is not what you should pass on to the next generation, because commodification is like kind of trying to take your physical artifacts to the afterlife with you. It doesn't work that way, you know. There's a cycle of life that we need to respect, and that will come back to my second image. I think one of the things, I mean, it's interesting talking from the Aotearoa New Zealand context, because more often than not, I'm typically talking from SDSN youth perspective for the global perspective. But the fact that we need to also recognise that 16% of the global population is within that youth population. So it's one of the largest youth populations that we have to date. So how many young people have we got being handed the money bag in the carbon dioxide world? The largest generation that's ever been recorded, particularly in nations where their youth bulges. And as we already heard Cameron talk about in that space, a lot of those are in the Pacific already. So there are a lot of young people. In the context of Aotearoa New Zealand, it's not just, you know, the element of carbon dioxide in the environment that is one of those elements. It's a lot of the ones that Izzy already brought up. You know, the cost of living crisis is a big one at the moment due to global recession, and that wasn't just the pandemic, that's been reoccurring since the global financial crisis. War and conflict has been a massive one across the world, whether or not you're involved in the situation in Afghanistan or Ukraine, because we're in the Pacific, we're still impacted by it. And one of the other things that we're seeing is the Pacific region, and all of our nations have been impacted in that space, is increasingly seeing this element of Cold War behaviour, which is making particularly the Pacific Islands and Aotearoa New Zealand quite nervous in those spaces. What does this mean for our future? Particularly when we also see those sort of negotiations of things such as nuclear waste being dumped into the Pacific region as well, off the basis of these trade agreements and other types of things going on in these spaces. The climate crisis is obviously a massive one within that space, because we are seeing sinking islands, and Aotearoa New Zealand is currently thinking about how many young people will be coming over as climate refugees, with the islands like Nauru and other ones in those spaces impacted as much as they are. Unemployment and widespread poverty, already a big one that Izzy talked about. You know, one of the things that we saw in Aotearoa New Zealand is in 2022, about mid-year, 10.3% of children were living in significant hardship, and that youth poverty was quite significant. Things like not being able to afford basic meals, not being able to afford shoes if they're walking to school, not being able to afford, you know, things that allow them to do their education. And then we also had that element of mental health and well-being, which Aotearoa New Zealand, you would have seen in the statistics that Izzy showed, is quite an interesting impact for those between the ages, particularly of 20 to 24, who have a rate of 21.4 per on 100,000 people, unfortunately, who have been involved in some type of self-inflicted death, which is a tragedy and is something that our nation grieves continuously. But I think this comes back to this word that I wanted to connect with this image that I was sharing there. The word that I like to use in this space is called waithood. It's a word that was created by an awesome author who's been involved over in Africa. She is an academic who researches into child and youth engagement into political processes. And she says that this waithood is the concept of being in a situation between worlds, a sort of prolonged limbo. It's that ability to be suspended between my childhood, which is really clear as to when I'm in school and things like that, and my adulthood, which is my life that is somewhere over there that I'm supposed to be engaging in, which is traditionally associated at this point in time, like the businessman, with being your economic development and your ability to engage as an economic citizen. She talks about how this has made youth transition really, really difficult, and why we don't see youth as actively involved in policy, particularly in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then a little bit further outside of that, because it's connected to the element of livelihood. Young people are now improvising that element of livelihood to try and get to where they need to be in their personal relationships and their social life, in order to be able to achieve what they need to get within this economic citizenship. So we see this element of the sort of in between state, and I know in Europe it's now been extended out to the age of 40 that young people are, which is absolutely ridiculous when you're looking at the youth parliament structure that they're using within that space, given the fact that if you were during the medieval age, to be 40 you would have probably had 20 plus kids and would be on the decline of your life. And as Cameron said, it's now moved up to 30, the definition of youth and young people within those spaces. I am a massive fan of a writer called Henry Giroux. If you have not read his stuff, please do. He's a wonderful writer, but he says youth haunts adult society because it references adults need to be attentive for a future that others will inhabit. Again, we're going back to that custodianship. The weighthood that we see within that word is connected to the element which John was talking about. There's this difficulty in that transition between youth and adults, and it's that pathway of the limbo between what is it that we are inheriting, what is it that we are passing along between different generations. So that's where I want to bring you to the third image, which I think is a pretty cool one, and the one that we work with a lot in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And this is a gift that we gave to the Ministry of Education in partnership with our Indigenous and tribal perspectives from student associations that we work with in the nation. And it's known as the harakeke plant. The image of the harakeke plant plays a significant role in Māori society and culture. It is the flax bush, for those of you who don't know the word harakeke, and it is the image of sustainability and the ability to rejuvenate and look after the ecosystem as well as a community. The reason that it is this way is because the leaves of the harakeke plant, which are used in weaving, traditionally weaving for cloaks for a chief, are divided typically into three parts. The outer leaves, or the outer part of the plant, are the tupuna. They're the ancestors. They're the ones who guide us and give us a sense of direction. The slightly more inner leaves are known as the matua, and they are the grandparents, uncles, aunts, and parents who are in that space guiding young people as they move along their life. And then the inner parts of the plant are known as the rito, or in our case, we sometimes call it rangatahi, which is young people or youth. Now, there's a tradition with the harakeke plant, when you are cutting it so that you can do your weavings, you never ever cut the rito or the rangatahi plant, part of the plant, the center, because when you do that, you kill the plant. And the reason for that is because that's where the plant's inheritance comes from. We cut the elder plant leaves from the outside of the plant, and they are what are used for weaving. And the weaving is what represents the responsibility for the community. So it's interesting when we see these two images that I put forward here. In one case, we see something being inherited from a custodianship, which is simply on the basis of a physical means. And the other, we see the inheritance of young people in the context of a wider ecosystem that is specifically caring about when, how, and what it is they are wanting to grow within that space. And from there, it's able to develop in that ecosystem in a way that's sustainable. It also changes the way we look at the word weighthood. When we look at the concept of the word weighthood in the image of the child just being in this environment where there's money around them in this deteriorating world. The weighthood is when I am able to then pass the baton on to you when I have exhausted the planet's resources that are already here. In the context of the harakeke plant, in contradiction to that, weighthood is I am protecting what needs to be protected, allowing it to flourish enough so that it is confident enough to grow and can sustain itself for the future. So those are my two images I'd like to leave you with. And the lasting question is, which do you think is going to help youth engage better? So thanks so much, Izzy.
That was so cute. Thank you so much, Ellen. That was wonderful. And finally, we have a video that's been sent in by Alex, who is going to give us a perspective and story on data collection. So Alex is a senior economist and deputy director of the Indo-Pacific Development Center, a dedicated policy research center within the Lowy Institute. He also directs the Lowy Institute's Pacific Aid Map project, which is what he talks about in this video.
Hi, my name is Alex Dayant, and I am a researcher at the Lowy Institute. Today, I will share with you the story of how I debunked the prevailing notion of Chinese debt trap diplomacy in the Pacific by harnessing the power of data on development. Ever since I started my job as a foreign policy analyst at the Lowy Institute, grappling with the concern of a Chinese engagement in the Pacific has been an integral aspect of my role. I constantly delve into questions such as the motivations behind Beijing's involvement in the region, the repercussions of Chinese investments in our neighborhood, and, most importantly, how these factors influence Australia's foreign policy objectives. To get to the bottom of this, I developed a tool called the Pacific Aid Map that tracks the flows of development finance from the international community to the Pacific Islands. In any given year, around 70 different donors actively support the region. Those are either traditional donors like Australia, New Zealand, and France, or they are non-traditional donors such as China, Taiwan, or India. Accessing project information regarding these development investments is a challenging task as it is scarce, lacks transparency, and is difficult to access. Most importantly, there is not one single platform where all partners are documenting those projects. The Pacific Aid Map aims to bridge this gap. While traditional partners are obligated to report their development finance information at the project level, the same cannot be said for non-traditional donors. Obtaining project information from those donors requires a more hands-on approach, where our team meticulously looked for project information in every press release, every social media post, and every budget document of every Pacific Island countries. What we ended up with is the largest aid and development project database ever assembled on the Pacific Islands. For the first time, we could see who was doing what and to what extent. With this in hand, and combined with additional economic data available online, I was able to better analyze the impact of China's development project in the Pacific, which allowed me to figure out whether accusations surrounding China's alleged debt trap diplomacy were true or not. What I found was surprising. First, the debt situation in the Pacific has worsened over the years, and today, many countries are considered as being at high risk of debt distress by the IMF. But I discovered that China is not an active lender in most of those countries. Second, China is actually not the largest overall lender in the Pacific either. The multilateral development banks are. Actually, taken together, traditional donors still provide more than 60% of all the loans to the region. Third, Chinese official lending is globally on commercial terms, but not in the Pacific. 97% of Chinese loans in the region have been concessional EXIM loans, which are significantly cheaper than market rates. In fact, when compared to other lenders in the Pacific, Chinese loans can often be cheaper. And finally, the Chinese loans are not skewed towards countries in high risk of debt distress, but rather towards countries that are in low or moderate risk. Overall, this analysis shows that China has not engaged in debt trap diplomacy in the Pacific. Rather, Beijing has positively contributed to the development of the region. This analysis and my key findings made a big splash and contributed to change the narrative. But this doesn't mean those facts will hold forever. Actually, my team and I are currently working on an analysis of recent large infrastructure loans provided by China to Vanuatu. These loans have the potential to place the country in a difficult debt situation. In conclusion, China holds significant influence as a donor in the Pacific region. However, due to Beijing's lack of transparency and our limited understanding of China's intention in the area, many engage in speculations regarding China's motives in the region. Leveraging the power of data on development helps us bring clarity to the aid landscape and allows us to acknowledge that China does contribute positively to advancing the Pacific's sustainable development goals. These projects play a role in supporting the region's progress toward achieving its development objectives, and this needs to be highlighted. I hope this has convinced you that using data for development has a real role to play in the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you to Alex, if you're watching this recording later on. Yeah, so thank you so much for all the participants of the Talanoa. I hope everybody watching has been able to take something from all of these very varied and different stories and can come to your own conclusion about why the work that we've done here with this report is very important, not only for the region, but for advancing sustainable development. So finally, please do keep engaging with us. We would love to make sure that we keep working together. Before I share some extra links, I did want to give some acknowledgements. So firstly, I'd like to obviously thank Mardi and Alice for your incredible work with the data analysis. I couldn't have done it, so I'm so glad that you were on our little team to help put this all together. A thank you to all the writers of this project. So these are all the young people we engaged with. You'll see their voices throughout the report. They wrote testimonials, they interviewed their friends, and they did extra research to help us support the project. So very grateful to all of you. A thank you to the editors. So these are all the young people who helped us edit the report. It was a big undertaking. It's a very technical report. So I was so grateful that you were willing to learn with us and edit the report. And obviously an enormous thank you to our mentors and advisors, to Cameron Allen, to John Thwaites, who you've heard from today, and obviously a humongous thank you to Tal Keston. Your support for this report and for SDSN Youth, Australia, New Zealand, Pacific has been so invaluable, and you are the reason why this all exists. So thank you so much. Yeah, as I said, please do engage with us if you are interested in working with us for one of these workshops about the methodology or about youth engagement. Do let us know. And I would like to leave you with this slide here. If you want to, please do read the report. Please share it with the people you know. We'd love to keep this report and the findings we have rolling. We think it's an amazing thing that we've been able to put this together, and we do hope that we can create an international effort around this. We can find SDSN Youth, SDSN Youth Australia, New Zealand, Pacific, SDSN Aus New Zealand, Pacific, and the Monash Sustainable Development Institute on social media. Just search any of those names on social media, and I'm sure you'll be able to find where you can link up with all of us. And if you have any questions, please do email me. My email is on the back of the report and on the back of the front cover of the report. So if you need anything, do let me know. And finally, thank you. Thank you all so much for listening and showing interest in young people. Keep fighting the power, keep making sure we keep the sustainable development goals alive, and make sure that we can achieve some sustainable development, because we owe it to the next generations. Thank you so much for being here.